Would you pay $5,000 for a single prayer? Jonathan Carter did. He was a millionaire who had everything money could buy, but his soul was empty. He thought he could purchase peace from a homeless veteran on a church step, but the answer he got wasn't what he expected, and it changed his life forever. The core tease. In this story, we explore how an unearned blessing from a man with nothing managed to break through the armor of a man with millions. It's a journey about fatherhood, forgiveness, and the things that actually matter. Call to action, CTA. Stick around to see how this story ends. But before we begin, what city are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the heart. Let's dive in. Jonathan Carter stood at the precipice of his own existence, gazing out from his 80-story penthouse at a world that looked like a flickering carpet of gold, yet felt like a barren, gilded wasteland. At 42, he had achieved the impossible, becoming the sole architect of a pharmaceutical empire valued at over $200 million. His name was a whispered legend in the ivory towers of New York and the secretive boardrooms of Zurich, a name synonymous with a ruthless, surgical precision that inspired both desperate envy and cold-blooded fear. He was the man who had turned chemistry into currency, yet as he stood in his office, a sprawling fortress of blood-dark mahogany and surgical brushed steel, he realized that he was breathing air that felt recycled, sterile, and entirely devoid of the oxygen of human connection. The silence within these walls was not peaceful. It was a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum that seemed to draw the very soul out of his chest. The decay of his personal world had been a slow, agonizing erosion that he had ignored in favor of profit margins and patent wars. 6 months ago, the silence had begun with the closing of a door. His wife, Catherine, hadn't left with the explosive theatricality of a scorned woman. There were no screams, no shattered glass, no bitter litany of his failures. Instead, she had looked at him with a profound, weary pity, a gaze so sharp and sorrowful that it had burned deeper into his psyche than any corporate insult ever could. She had walked away from the luxury, the cars, and the prestige because she had realized she was married to a monument, not a man. Since then, the house had felt like a museum of a life they never actually lived. Then there was Ellie, his 19-year-old daughter, who had stopped answering his calls months ago. Her final communication sat on his phone like a jagged blade of frozen truth. A text message he read until the words blurred into meaningless shapes. You don't want a daughter, Dad. You want a legacy. You want a placeholder in your biography. Call me when you find your heartbeat. Every time he looked at that message, he felt a phantom pain in his chest, a reminder that he had traded his daughter's childhood for quarterly earnings and international expansion. He had been a provider who had provided everything except his presence, and now, he was a ghost in her life. But the final, crushing pillar of his reality had fallen just 2 weeks ago. His father, a man who had spent 40 grueling years as a penniless pastor in a dying, soot-stained coal town, had passed away. Jonathan had attended the funeral in a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than his father's annual salary, a garment that felt like a suit of armor against the grief he was supposed to feel. He was surrounded by a sea of elderly parishioners, men and women with calloused hands and tear-streaked faces, who wept openly for a man they called a saint. They spoke of his father's kindness, his sacrifice, and his unshakable faith. Jonathan, standing at the front, felt like a grotesque statue. He felt no grief, no sorrow, and no connection to the man in the casket. Instead, he felt a terrifying, hollow numbness, a psychological permafrost that had settled over his heart. He had spent his entire adult life building an empire of pills and patents specifically to prove to his father that he was more than a small-town preacher, that he was a titan of the modern world. Standing by the grave, he finally realized the devastating irony. In his pursuit of being more, he had become infinitely less. He was a king of sand, watching his empire wash away in a tide of irrelevance. This numbness was a predator, eating him from the inside out. He had tried to force the tears to come. He had sat in the dark with a bottle of 100-year-old scotch, waiting for the dam to break, but the ice held firm. He was a man frozen in the absolute zero of his own success. His assistant, a woman who had seen him at his most ruthless, had noticed the subtle cracks in his facade, the way he stared at blank screens, the way he forgot to eat, the way his hands shook during silent moments. 2 days ago, she had leaned over his desk and whispered a rumor she had heard in her own neighborhood. A story about an old man who sat on the steps of a small, crumbling church in the slums. A man whose prayers were said to be different, capable of mending the spirits that science had given up on. Driven by a desperation that bordered on a fever dream madness, Jonathan had abandoned his scheduled meetings and his security detail. He found himself behind the wheel of his black BMW, descending from the glass towers and driving deep into a part of the city his GPS seemed to struggle to recognize. The streets turned from polished asphalt to cracked concrete. The neon signs of luxury brands were replaced by the flickering, desperate glow of liquor stores and boarded-up tenements. He was a man who didn't believe in God, didn't believe in miracles, and certainly didn't believe in the power of a stranger's prayer. Yet, as the shadows of the neglected neighborhood closed in around his car, Jonathan Carter felt a sliver of something he hadn't felt in years. A raw, terrifying hope. He was looking for a miracle he didn't believe in. A heartbeat he thought he had lost forever. And a way to finally melt the ice that had become his only companion. He pulled up to the curb of a church that looked as broken as he felt, stepped out into the biting air, and prepared to offer everything he owned for a single spark of humanity. Jonathan came back the next morning. And the morning after that. And every morning for 2 weeks. Each time, he found Abraham on the same step, praying for people he'd never meet, carrying burdens that weren't his own because compassion didn't calculate cost-benefit ratios. They talked about everything and nothing. Jonathan's fractured family, Abraham's lost wife, the war that had broken Abraham decades ago, the wealth that had broken Jonathan more recently, conversations that circled around faith without Jonathan committing to believing, around healing without knowing if he was actually healing. But slowly, imperceptibly, something shifted. Jonathan started feeling his grief instead of numbing it. Started crying at memories of his father instead of freezing them out. Started texting his daughter daily even though she hadn't responded yet. Each morning, Abraham prayed the same blessing over him. And each morning, Jonathan felt a little more human, a little more real, a little more capable of bearing his own heart. On the 15th morning, Jonathan arrived to find Abraham shivering despite the summer heat. His cough was wet and deep, rattling in his chest. He looked smaller somehow, frilier, less like the solid presence Jonathan had come to depend on, and more like what he actually was, an 80-year-old man living on the streets. "You're sick," Jonathan said, alarm cutting through his usual reserve. "Old people get sick. It passes." Abraham's voice was hoarse, but still trying for its usual calm. "When did you last eat? Where did you sleep last night?" Abraham waved away the questions with a trembling hand. "I'm fine. God provides." "God isn't providing enough. You need a doctor. You need food. You need." Jonathan reached for his wallet automatically, then stopped himself. Abraham would refuse money. He always refused money. But watching this man who'd given him so much, who'd asked for nothing in return, shiver in the morning heat, something crystallized in Jonathan's mind. This wasn't about buying a blessing anymore. This wasn't a transaction or an obligation. This was about actually caring whether another human being survived. About friendship. About the connection Abraham had said mattered more than any payment. "Let me help," Jonathan said, the words coming out more plea than offer. Not as payment. Not as debt. But as a friend. As someone who actually gives a damn whether you live or die. Abraham looked at him, those clouded eyes seeing straight through Jonathan's carefully maintained walls to the transformation happening underneath. "What are you offering?" "My guest house. It's empty. Has a bed, bathroom, small kitchen. You could stay there. Rest. Heal. Get warm and fed and see a doctor. No strings, no expectations. Just shelter. Please. You're a millionaire offering your guest house to a homeless man. Your neighbors will be thrilled." "I don't care about my neighbors. I care about you." Jonathan's voice broke. "You saved my life, Abraham. You didn't take money for it. You didn't ask for anything in return. But maybe let me give you shelter now. Not as payment for what you gave me. As, what did you call it? Connection. As caring about what happens to you." Abraham was quiet for so long Jonathan thought he'd refuse. The old man seemed to be weighing something internal, wrestling with pride or principle or both. Finally, slowly he nodded. Until I'm well. Then I come back here. These steps are my church. My purpose. But yes, until I'm well, I'll accept your shelter. Not because I need luxury, but because maybe God is providing through you. And I'd be a fool to refuse what he's offering. Jonathan helped Abraham to his car, supporting the old man's weight, shocked by how light he was, like years of giving had worn him down to pure essence. The drive to his estate was quiet, Abraham's head resting against the window, exhaustion evident in every line of his weathered face. The guest house was small by Jonathan's standards, 3 rooms behind his main mansion, designed for visitors who never came because Jonathan had systematically destroyed every relationship in his life. But as they walked in, Abraham's expression was one of wonder. "It's a palace," he whispered. "A door that locks. Heat. A real bed. You have no idea what that means to someone who's spent 20 years vulnerable to every weather and every predator." Jonathan made coffee while Abraham sat at the small table, still shivering but beginning to relax. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping coffee as the sun climbed higher, both understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them. "I tried to call my daughter yesterday," Jonathan said finally. "Actually called, not just texted. She didn't answer, but I left a voicemail. Told her I was sorry, that I wanted to change, that I was learning from a homeless man to be human again." And she texted back 3 hours later. One word. Okay. Just okay. But Abraham, it felt like winning the lottery. Like maybe, possibly, she might give me another chance. That's because it is winning. Just not the lottery you used to play. Over the next week, Jonathan took Abraham to his personal physician, paying for a complete examination, medication for pneumonia, treatment for a dozen ailments that come from living on the streets. He bought Abraham new clothes, though the old man insisted on keeping his military jacket. "My brothers gave me this. The ones who didn't come home. I can't let it go." Abraham protested every expense at first, old pride warring with evident need. But eventually he accepted what couldn't be refused. Medical care that would save his life, food that would restore his strength, shelter that would let him heal. And a strange thing happened. As Abraham healed physically in the guest house, Jonathan healed emotionally. He started visiting his father's grave, sitting on the grass and talking to the headstone like his father could hear, saying all the things he'd never said. "I loved you. I'm proud of who you were. I wish I'd been more like you instead of trying so hard to be different. I'm sorry I thought money mattered more than ministry. You were right about everything." His daughter Ellie finally agreed to meet for coffee. 30 minutes in a Starbucks where she said maybe 10 words, but it was 10 more words than last month. Progress measured in syllables, in the slight softening of her expression when Jonathan admitted, "I don't know how to be a good father, but I'm trying. And I have a teacher now." A teacher? Ellie's first real question, her curiosity overcoming her guardedness. "A homeless veteran who prays on church steps. He's staying in my guest house. Recovering from pneumonia. He's becoming a friend. Maybe the first real friend I've had in years." Ellie looked at him like he'd transformed into someone unrecognizable. "You invited a homeless man to live with you?" "I did. And he's the wisest person I've ever met. He doesn't want my money. Just wants me to be human." Which, as it turns out, is really hard to learn at 42. Something flickered in Ellie's eyes. Not forgiveness yet, but maybe curiosity. Maybe the beginning of hope that her father could actually change. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall. Light getting through. That evening, Jonathan found Abraham in the guest house garden, kneeling in the dirt despite his still healing lungs. The old man's weathered hands moved through neglected flower beds with surprising gentleness, pulling weeds, turning soil, coaxing life back into plants the previous owner had abandoned. "You garden?" Jonathan asked, surprised. "My wife loved gardens." Abraham didn't look up, focused on his work. "After she died, I kept gardening wherever I could. Community plots, church grounds, anywhere that would let an old homeless man dig in the dirt. It reminds me that things can grow even in the hardest soil." That care and patience can bring life back to what looks dead. Is that what you're doing with me? Gardening. Abraham finally looked up, a slight smile on his weathered face. Maybe. Or maybe you're gardening me. Giving this old plant some shelter and water. Seeing if it'll bloom one more time before winter comes. Jonathan grabbed a spare pair of gloves from the shed and knelt beside Abraham. He'd never gardened in his life. Landscapers handled his property, keeping everything manicured and perfect. But there was something deeply satisfying about putting his hands in actual dirt, about the simple work of pulling weeds and clearing space for growth. They worked together until dark, two men from completely different worlds finding common ground in the simple act of helping things grow. Jonathan told Abraham about the coffee meeting with Ellie, about the hesitant conversation, about the tiny movement toward reconciliation. You're learning, Abraham said, gently patting soil around a newly transplanted rosebush. That relationships aren't transactions. They're gardens. You plant, you water, you wait. And if you're patient and consistent, eventually something grows. But you can't force it. Can't buy it. Can't rush it. You just have to keep showing up. I'm not good at patience. I noticed. But you're learning. That blessing I gave you 3 weeks ago? It's working. Not because I have magic powers, but because you're doing the work. Feeling the pain. Making the calls. Showing up. The blessing just gave you permission to start. You're doing the actual transformation. Jonathan sat back on his heels, hands dirty from honest work. Abraham, I need to ask you something. That first morning, when I tried to pay you, were you angry? Did you think I was insulting? Abraham considered this carefully, still working the soil. No. I was sad. Sad that someone was so lost they thought peace could be purchased. But also hopeful, because anyone desperate enough to try to buy a blessing is someone ready for transformation. They've reached the end of what money can do. And that's when real change becomes possible. I was such an arrogant fool. You were scared and hurting. There's a difference. And son, you're still scared. But now you're scared and trying, which is infinitely better than scared and numb. They finished the garden as stars emerged overhead. Jonathan made dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, simple food he'd learned to cook since Abraham moved in. They ate together at the small table, talking about Abraham's time in Vietnam, the brothers he'd lost, the wife who'd anchored him afterward, the slow spiral into homelessness after she died. You know, Jonathan said, pouring them both more water, with your wisdom, your presence, your ability to connect with people, you could have any job. Counselor, therapist, spiritual advisor. Why stay homeless? Why live on church steps when you could have comfort? Abraham set down his fork, meeting Jonathan's eyes directly. Because comfort isn't the point. Connection is. If I had a comfortable home, an office, credentials on a wall, I might start to believe those things mattered. Might forget that what I offer is only valuable because it's free, because it comes from a place of having nothing except the ability to see people's pain and sit with it. But you're here now, in my comfortable guest house. Temporarily. Until I'm well. Then back to the steps, back to the prayers, back to the purpose God gave me. This, he gestured around the comfortable room. This is a gift you're giving me. But it's not who I am. I'm the man on the church steps. That's where I belong. What if I said I need you? That our daily conversations are healing me more than any therapist ever did. That's not need, that's want. And it's good you're learning the difference. You want me to stay because our friendship brings you peace. But you don't need me. You've already learned what I came to teach you. How to feel again. How to connect honestly. How to value people over profit. That's yours now. You can carry it without me. I don't want to carry it without you. Then visit. Come to the church steps when you need reminding. But son, your life is out there. With your daughter. With whatever new thing you build after letting go of the old thing. I can't be your crutch forever. I can only be your friend. And real friends let each other grow. Even when growing means growing apart. Jonathan felt the familiar fear of loss, of abandonment, of people leaving. But underneath it, something new. Acceptance. Understanding that Abraham was right. That dependency would destroy what the blessing had created. When you leave, Jonathan said quietly, When you go back to those steps, can I still visit? Can we still talk? Every morning at dawn if you want. I'll be there. And Jonathan. Abraham's voice was warm. If you bring yourself instead of your wallet, if you come as a friend instead of a client, I'll always be glad to see you. Later that night, lying in his too large bed in his too large house, Jonathan thought about blessings. He tried to buy one, treating spiritual connection like a commodity to be purchased. Instead, he'd received something infinitely more valuable. A friendship that asked nothing and gave everything. A mirror that showed him who he'd become and who he could still be. A teacher who refused payment because the teaching itself was the greatest gift. Abraham had blessed him not with words alone, but with presence. With the willingness to sit beside Jonathan's pain without trying to fix it. With prayers that didn't change circumstances, but changed Jonathan's capacity to bear those circumstances. With friendship that demonstrated what his father had spent a lifetime trying to teach. That grace is free, connection is sacred, and the things that matter most can never be purchased. And Jonathan had blessed Abraham too, though he was only beginning to understand how, not just with shelter and medical care. Those were mere logistics, but with dignity, with recognition. With the reminder that even someone who'd lost everything society valued still had infinite worth, still mattered, still had wisdom desperately needed in a world that measured value only in dollars. They were saving each other, not with grand gestures or financial transactions, but with the simple revolutionary act of seeing each other as fully human beings worthy of care and respect. The blessing was working, on both of them. In ways neither had expected when Jonathan first approached those church steps with his wallet open and his heart closed. And the transformation had barely begun. 3 weeks after Abraham had moved into the guest house. A period of quiet adjustment where the clinking of silver against china and the soft turning of pages replaced the sterile silence of the mansion. Jonathan received a call that felt like a summons from a past life. It was his father's former church. A modest beacon of hope in a town that time and industry had forgotten. They were planning a memorial service to celebrate Pastor Carter's 30 years of tireless ministry, and they wanted Jonathan to speak. His immediate reaction was a cold, visceral surge of panic. What could he possibly say to a room full of people who had truly known the man? Could he admit that he had spent 3 decades treating his father's life work as a quaint, noble failure? Could he confess that he had once looked his father in the eye and told him that ministry was a tragic waste of a brilliant mind? He stood in the doorway of the guest house, the phone a heavy weight in his hand, feeling like an imposter in his own skin. Abraham looked up from a tattered book, his eyes catching the flicker of terror on Jonathan's face. "Problem?" he asked, his voice like a calm harbor in Jonathan's internal storm. "They want me to speak at my father's memorial," Jonathan admitted, his voice cracking. "I can't. I have nothing to say that won't expose me as the failure of a son I was. I chose wealth over his wisdom, and only now, when the earth is already over him, do I understand what I lost." Abraham set the book aside, his presence filling the room with a grounded authority that no boardroom could replicate. "Or," Abraham said gently, "you have everything to say. You have a story about learning late what he tried to teach early. You have the truth of discovering through absolute loss what success was too loud to let you hear. Tell them how a homeless man's blessing helped you finally translate your father's language." Jonathan looked away, struggling. "I still don't know if I believe what he believed, Abraham. I don't know if I believe in God." Abraham's response was a soft, knowing smile. "But you believe in connection now. You believe in presence. You believe that money is a poor substitute for peace. Your father believed those things too. It seems to me, Jonathan, that you've finally found common ground." Jonathan called the church back and accepted, though the yes felt like a leap into a dark abyss. "Come with me," he told Abraham after hanging up. "I need you there." Abraham looked down at his donated clothes, his hands, rough and weathered, resting on his knees. "I'm a man from the streets, Jonathan. Your father's congregation is full of respectable people. They won't." Jonathan interrupted him, his voice firm for the first time in weeks. "You are my friend. You are the man who bridged the gap. He would have considered you family, because you did for me what he spent a lifetime praying for." The days leading up to the service were a blur of sleepless nights and crumpled drafts. Jonathan wrote and deleted, drafted and destroyed. Nothing felt honest enough. Every word felt like a hollow tribute to a man he had only just begun to meet. On Friday night, Abraham found Jonathan sitting on the floor of the guest house, surrounded by a sea of rejected speeches, looking utterly defeated. "Stop writing," Abraham said, sitting down on a nearby chair. "Tomorrow, don't read from a script. Just speak from the broken place. People don't want a polished eulogy. They want the truth about how a man's life changed yours, even if you were too stubborn to notice it while he was breathing." Jonathan shook his head. "I can't stand up there and admit I ignored him for 30 years. Abraham leaned forward. "Yes, you can. Because you can also tell them that his teaching found a way to reach you even after he was gone. His legacy isn't just what he did in that pulpit. It's how his influence traveled through the dark, through the cold, and through a homeless man on a church step just to finally penetrate your heart." Saturday morning arrived with a crisp, unforgiving clarity. Jonathan dressed in a simple dark suit, avoiding the flashier accessories of his corporate life, and helped Abraham into the car. The old man looked rejuvenated, stronger, his skin clearer after 3 weeks of decent meals and safety, but he still carried the quiet humility of the steps. As they pulled up to the church, Jonathan realized he had forgotten how small it was. It was a modest building in a neighborhood where the paint was peeling and the fences were leaning, yet it was packed to the rafters. People were streaming in, wearing their Sunday best, a vibrant tapestry of lives touched by a man who had chosen impact over income. They slipped into a back pew, Jonathan feeling a strange mix of anonymity and exposure. Near the front, he saw Ellie sitting with her mother. When she turned and caught his eye, there was no smile, but there was an acknowledgement. A silent bridge being built in the air between them. The service was a symphony of stories, accounts of Pastor Carter's quiet sacrifices, his late-night visits to the suffering, and his refusal to measure success by anything other than the hope he instilled in others. When Jonathan was called to the podium, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He walked to the front, the preparation in his pocket feeling like lead, and looked out at the sea of faces. He saw Abraham's encouraging nod from the shadows of the back row, and he saw Ellie, her expression unreadable but her attention absolute. He took a breath, pushed his notes aside, and let the armor fall. "My father and I lived in parallel worlds," he began, his voice echoing in the rafters. "For 30 years he chose modest income and maximum impact, while I chose the opposite. I thought I was winning. I thought his life was small." Jonathan's voice broke as he gestured toward Abraham. "When he died, I was a man of glass, transparent, cold, and empty. I couldn't even cry. I thought I was broken beyond repair. Then I met a man on a church step and tried to buy a blessing from him like it was a pharmaceutical patent. He refused my money and gave me the blessing for free. And in that moment of unearned grace, I finally heard my father's voice." He looked directly at his father's photograph on the altar, tears streaming freely now. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I measured my worth by my bank account instead of the love I gave. I'm sorry I had to lose you to finally see you. But I want you to know, I finally get it. Your legacy isn't this building. It's the fact that your prayer traveled through a stranger to save a son who didn't want to be saved." The silence in the church was profound, broken only by the soft sobs of the congregation. Jonathan stepped down, exhausted and emptied, only to be met in the aisle by Ellie. She didn't say a word. She simply threw her arms around him in a real, desperate hug. The kind of embrace he hadn't felt since she was a child. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered. After the service, as the crowd lingered, an elderly woman clutched Jonathan's hand. "Your father prayed for you every dawn at this altar," she whispered. "He didn't pray for your success, he prayed for your sight. He used to say, 'My son is a king in a kingdom of glass, and I just want him to feel the sun on his face before I go.'" Jonathan felt the final walls of his fortress crumble. He looked back at the exit where Abraham stood, a silent sentinel of the truth. The transaction of his old life was over. The transformation of his new life had begun. He walked out into the sunlight, a man who had lost his empire but finally, miraculously, found his home. The weeks following the memorial were the most peaceful Jonathan had ever known. He and Ellie began meeting for dinner twice a week, slowly rebuilding a bridge over years of silence. But as the winter chill began to settle in, Abraham grew restless. He spent more time staring out the window of the guest house at the horizon. One morning, Jonathan found Abraham with his old military jacket on, and his small bag packed. "It's time, Jonathan," the old man said softly. "You don't have to go back to the steps, Abraham. I've already bought a small house near the church. It's yours. No rent, no strings. You can pray from a porch instead of cold concrete." Abraham smiled, a weary but beautiful expression. "You're still trying to fix the world with titles and deeds, son. I belong on those steps. If I'm not there, who will the next Jonathan find when they've reached the end of their rope? I am a signpost. A signpost doesn't move into a house. It stays where the road is hardest." Jonathan realized he couldn't win this argument with logic. He hugged the old man, a long, fierce embrace. Before he left, Abraham handed Jonathan a small, weathered wooden cross, carved by hand. "My father gave me this in the jungle in '68. It's seen more darkness than you can imagine, but it never lost its shape. Neither will you." Jonathan's return to his company was not the business as usual his board of directors expected. He walked into the boardroom not with a laptop, but with the wooden cross in his pocket and a new vision in his eyes. He announced a radical shift. The company would cap profits on essential medications and open 3 free clinics in underserved neighborhoods, starting with the one surrounding his father's church. "You're destroying the stock value," one director shouted. "I'm increasing the human value," Jonathan replied, his voice calm and unshakable, a mirror of Abraham's tone. "We've spent decades treating sickness as a market. From now on, we treat it as a burden we help carry." He stepped down as CEO a month later, appointing a successor who shared his vision, and took a position as a simple board advisor. He sold his mansion, the monument to his ego, and moved into a modest home with a large garden. Every morning at dawn, Jonathan didn't check the stock market. He drove to the church steps. Sometimes he sat with Abraham in silence, sometimes they talked. But he always brought 2 cups of coffee. One Tuesday in late February, the air was particularly biting. Jonathan arrived at the church, the steam rising from the coffee cups in his car. But when he looked at the 3rd step, it was empty. A single wool cap sat there, dusted with a light layer of snow. Jonathan's heart sank. He found the church janitor, who pointed toward the hospital. Abraham had passed away in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after 80 years of carrying the weight of others' prayers. At the funeral there were no CEOs, no limousines. Just the homeless, the broken, and the miracles Abraham had prayed for. Ellie sat beside Jonathan, holding his hand. When it was Jonathan's turn to speak, he didn't go to the podium. He sat on the floor at the front of the chapel. "I once tried to buy a blessing for $5,000, he told the room. "I thought I was the one doing the favor by offering money to a man with nothing. I was wrong. I was the beggar, and he was the king." After the service, Jonathan went back to the church steps. He sat on the 3rd stone, feeling the cold seep through his coat. He closed his eyes and for the first time, he didn't wait for Abraham to start. Jonathan began to pray. He prayed for his daughter, for his employees, and for the next person who would walk up those steps with a heavy heart and a full wallet. As the sun rose, Jonathan felt a strange warmth on his shoulder, the phantom weight of a weathered hand. The blessing wasn't a transaction that ended with Abraham's death. It was a torch. And Jonathan Carter, the man who once had everything and nothing, finally knew how to keep it burning.